This is the staircase of the Laurentian Library now, attached to the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. It was part of the work Michelangelo did for the Medici in Florence, although it wasn't actually built until well after his death. I mentioned earlier that Francesco Maria della Rovere returned to Urbino after the death of Leo X. Leo had somehow been succeeded by the reform-minded Dutchman Adrian VI in one of the least expected results of any papal election ever, and he had allowed Francesco Maria to reoccupy a city. I suppose it was lucky for the Renaissance that Adrian lived only a year as Pope, because he stopped all expenditures on the arts in general. But he was one of the better Christians among the popes of the whole age, which, needless to say, certainly didn't make him popular. The people of Rome hated him as a gloomy, tightwad foreigner and cheered his death, says Durand, as though the city had been saved from an attack by the Turks. Here's the reading room of the library now, which, like the staircase, was not finished until some 50 years after Michelangelo drew up the original plans. He apparently even designed the parquet floor. It has a lot of very important books: the autographed copy of Il Cortegiano by Castiglione, a first edition of Il Principe, Machiavelli's magnum opus, the oldest copy of the Decameron, several 14th century copies of the Divine Comedy, a 5th century Virgil. Well, Adrian VI was succeeded by the more easygoing Giulio de' Medici as Clement VII, who tried to keep Michelangelo at work on projects like the sacristy tombs and the library for his family here, while Francesco Maria countered with threats and lawsuits in his effort to get him back to work on the tomb of Julius, and as a result, Michelangelo really finished nothing for either Clement or Francesco Maria. This is a portrait of Clement VII now, probably by Michelangelo's friend Sebastiano del Piombo. When he became Pope, Clement left Florence in charge of Ippolito de' Medici, the illegitimate son of the Duke de Nemours, and Alessandro, the illegitimate son, apparently, of Lorenzo, the Duke of Urbino. They were just about 10 at the time, and Cardinal Passerini, universally regarded now as a scheming, avaricious incompetent, was designated to act as something like regent for them. Alessandro, the more domineering of the two brats, grew up to be one of the nastiest people of the age and probably murdered Ippolito before being eventually assassinated himself. Clement here tried to just ignore what was going on in Florence. He had other big problems of his own. The Emperor Charles V wanted him to damn the French wanted him to damn the Germans, Henry VIII wanted a divorce, and Luther wanted his job. When he finally made a decision between the French and Germans, it was the wrong one. He sided with the French, and the imperial army clobbered them at Pavia in 1525, and Charles V sent his army with a large contingent of Lutherans to punish him, and the Medici bastards fled from Florence as the invasion moved south. The city of Rome was sacked, and Clement withdrew to Orvieto, where he met with Charles. And on the wall in what's called the Clement VII room in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, you can see them at the back. Clement now with a black beard. Charles was actually very conciliatory and offered to restore the Medici to power in Florence if Clement would crown him and recognize in just a kind of general way that he, Charles, was to be regarded as the arbiter of Italian politics. This was, in effect, a fait accompli, which it was easy enough for Clement to acknowledge. In 1529, as you can see in this painting on the wall of the same room, Florence was then besieged by the imperial army. The new republic there was under the leadership of the Gonfaloniere Niccolo Capone, and Michelangelo was commissioned to help build fortifications for the defense of the city, but it was a lost cause. Alessandro and the Medici, this time after just about a 4-year absence, were restored to power as the Republican leadership fled again in its turn. Michelangelo, however, did not flee the city, and a few years ago, a room which had been bricked up centuries ago was discovered beneath the new sacristy at San Lorenzo, and it is thought that Michelangelo might have occasionally, at least, hidden here and whiled away his time, making the drawings that still survive on the walls. Since he had helped defend the city against the return of the Medici, he was a wanted man. but Clement pardoned him on condition that he continue to work on the tombs upstairs. Here you can see more of the drawings, which at least do have the look of Michelangelo's style. When Clement died in 1534, however, Michelangelo, who didn't trust Alessandro one bit without Clement to exert some semblance of control over him, left the city for Rome and never returned. This is a bust of Michelangelo in the Bargello in Florence, which was made by Daniele da Volterra, a friend of his, so this is probably a good likeness of Michelangelo at about this point in his career, about the age of 60 or so, though with 30 years of life left. The one thing that can count, I guess, as a sort of love affair in Michelangelo's life began sometime after his arrival in Rome, when he became attached to Vittoria Colonna, a widow in her mid-50s. She presided at a sort of salon of intellectuals and poets, of which she considered herself one, and Michelangelo, too, did write a good deal of poetry, which is now highly regarded, much of it inspired by her. No one in Rome at this time, 20 years after Luther had posted his 95 Theses, was calling himself a Protestant, but Vittoria and her circle considered themselves liberal Catholics, and this, combined with the effect that Savonarola had had on him in his youth, is thought to have given a distinctly Protestant perspective to his religious outlook in his later life. It's unlikely that his relationship to Vittoria was other than platonic, but he certainly was devoted to her, and at her death in 1547 he was profoundly affected. There are just 2 or 3 places where Michelangelo lived in Rome that can be identified now. One was where the Star Hotel Michelangelo now is, as you can see, near St. Peter's. And one was where that bunch of trees stands today, just beside the Piazza Venezia. On the whole, Michelangelo comes across in surviving anecdotes rather like Beethoven, a man with few social graces who would have been unpleasant as a neighbor, let alone as a roommate, and who, were he not a genius, would probably not have fit well into any civilized socioeconomic subgroup. He did, however, have many close friends, and there are some inconsistencies in the surviving records of what he was like. At least one source says he dressed well, even fashionably, while among Vasari's anecdotes is one in which he mentions being present when Michelangelo took his boots off, and Vasari says they'd been on for so long the skin came off with them. If that's true, so much for good hygiene's contribution to long life. Clement's successor was Pope Paul III, and in 1536 he persuaded Michelangelo to paint the Last Judgment on the altar end of the wall of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo protested again, as he had to Julius, that he was a sculptor and really wanted to finish Julius's tomb. But after Francesco Maria della Rovere died, his son was more tractable and pronounced the family satisfied with the version that now stands in San Pietro in Vincoli, which left Michelangelo without a good excuse not to paint the Last Judgment. He finished it 6 years later, and Vasari called it finer by far than the ceiling, but few now agree with that. The subject itself is part of the problem. It's hard to make it other than unpleasant and nightmarish, and it was not at all a popular subject in the Renaissance. Among all the other generally accepted masterpieces by all the other artists of the era in Italy, there are few Last Judgments to be found. There's not time to go far into this now, but it's often suggested that we see the influence of the Reformation in this work. The emphasis is not on those few saved, but on the general threat of damnation. That is emphatically not a welcoming gesture that Christ is making. He is in the act of casting sinners into hell, as, according to Luther and Calvin, we inveterate sinners all deserve to be. If we get into paradise, it's because God is good, not because we are. The nudity of the saints, which probably would have raised no eyebrows 25 years earlier, was immediately criticized by some, and eventually Michelangelo's friend Daniele da Volterra was commissioned by Pope Pius V after Michelangelo's death to paint censoring drapery over parts of the figures, for which he has ever been stigmatized as the underwear painter. When the restoration of the Last Judgment was proposed a few years ago, the issue of whether or not the drapery should be removed became a very lively controversy. It was finally decided to leave the drapes on, in part because a surviving letter of Michelangelo seems to indicate that he approved such a step, that is, that he approved the original painting of the drapery. But I don't think the drapes were going to be removed in any case. Pope orders underwear removed was not a headline anyone at the Vatican wanted to have to explain. Near the bottom center of this picture, you can see St. Bartholomew holding his skin. He was flayed alive, achieving martyrdom, and it's now widely thought that the face on the skin is a self-portrait by Michelangelo. Here you see him up closer, and the face on the skin is at least not the same face on the figure that's holding the skin. If it is a self-portrait, it wasn't painted on one of his best days. Apropos of the Last Judgment being a sort of Protestant subject, I should say that it was no more popular with Protestant painters than it was with Catholic ones in Italy. It's the theme of God's dread judgment that was popular with Protestants, but of course Protestants, especially conservative ones, didn't want pictures of any kind in their churches. Michelangelo's last efforts as a painter are on the walls of the Pauline Chapel, the Pope's private chapel in the Vatican. Here's the conversion of Paul. I haven't seen this myself, so I can't say anything about how it actually looks, but the weird coloring is always mentioned. Words like metallic and acidic are often used to describe it. And strange, sometimes really jarring combinations of colors are another characteristic of Mannerist art, into which category Michelangelo's painting, especially his later painting, is sometimes put. The landscape here is typical of Michelangelo's treatment of it, which is to say that he virtually ignores it. While he was working on this in 1547, Pope Paul also named him Architect-in-Chief of St. Peter's, and had him draw up plans as well for the redevelopment, as it might now be called, of the Capitoline Hill. This is the top of the Capitoline Hill now, the Campidoglio as it is often called. Michelangelo was essentially the architect of the three buildings here, the Capitoline Museum on the left, the Palazzo dei Conservatori, also a museum on the right, and the Palazzo del Senatore, the seat of the mayor of Rome, at the back. He also designed the decoration of the pavement and arranged for the placement of the celebrated statue of Marcus Aurelius in the center of the whole project. The original's now in the Palazzo dei Conservatori. Little of all this was finished within his lifetime, however, and many modifications to his original ideas were apparently made. This is the Palazzo dei Conservatori. Perhaps the most important thing to notice here is the flat roof, which Michelangelo didn't invent, but with which he did make a major and influential architectural statement. By the 17th century, buildings with classical motifs and flat roofs will become common all over Europe, as the Gothic style will be finally given up even in France, as we'll see next year. It's hard to be sure about this, but Michelangelo is often given credit for inventing the pilasters that span both floors of the building, an arrangement that is sometimes called the colossal or giant order, and for the so-called broken pediments over the windows and the balustrades at the roofline. His most important work as an architect was, however, at St. Peter's. By the time Michelangelo became the architect of it, Bramante, Raphael, and Sangallo had preceded him, and it had been underway for almost half a century. Bramante's original plan called for a centrally planned church dominated by a dome, and the other architects, including Michelangelo, stuck essentially to that idea, but as we'll see next year, Paul V had his architect Maderno lengthen the church into a more traditional basilica form with a big facade in front of it that drastically altered the original look. Finally then, it was Bernini who designed and built the colonnades around the piazza and took over most of the interior decoration of the building as well, which wasn't finally finished until well into the 17th century. The dome, which was to have been the dominant feature, can now hardly be seen until one gets about a quarter of a mile from the church. Whether the dome is or is not Michelangelo's is still argued about, but it is often claimed now that his plan called for a lower, more hemispherical version, and that this more elongated dome was actually built to the design of Giacomo della Porta, Michelangelo's successor. One probably gets a better idea of what the church was originally intended to be like from the rear now. You can see the colossal pilasters here again, and Michelangelo is also sometimes said to have first used paired columns, which you can see on the drum of the dome, which is the only part that was finished by the time he died. The Pietà, which you see now in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo in Florence, was intended by Michelangelo for his own tomb, which he apparently at one time wanted to be in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. He was about 80 when he was working on it, and, frustrated at his inability to get the twisted left arm of Christ to his liking, he hit it with a hammer, breaking it in a way that is still obvious. It was left unfinished at his death, and a pupil of his named Tiberio Calcagni completed the figure at the left, but, says Rolf Schott, we're lucky he died before he could ruin the whole thing. The old man who is holding the body of Christ is thought to be Michelangelo himself, playing the role of Joseph of Arimathea. The last work on which Michelangelo put his hand is probably the so-called Rondanini Pietà, named after the family which long owned it. It's now in the Castello Sforzesco in Milan. This time it was the right arm that Michelangelo, now nearly 90, apparently broke again in anger at his own failure to get it the way he wanted. He was working on this within a week of his death in Rome in February 1564, and he bequeathed it to one of his servants. As I said, he apparently wanted at one time to be buried at Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, but after his death his body was taken back to Florence according to what were supposed to have been his revised last wishes. In any case, he was given a tremendous funeral in San Lorenzo and buried in this tomb in Santa Croce. Vasari says, with no irony intended, that Michelangelo was certainly lucky to have lived long enough for the Florentine Academy of Art to have been formed, which provided such a splendid ceremony and such a fine last resting place for him. At the high point of what's often called the High Renaissance in Rome in the early 16th century, Michelangelo was not the only genius in town. While he was painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael was at work just a few yards away on the papal apartments. This is the house in Urbino where Raffaello Santi, Raphael, was born in 1483. His father, Giovanni Santi, had been a court painter for the old hook-nosed Duke of Urbino, Federico da Montefeltro, about whom we heard earlier this quarter, and he must have been well paid because this is quite a fine house. This is the courtyard of it. Raphael's childhood was very different from Michelangelo's. His father, Raphael's, far from trying to prevent him from studying art, gave him his first lessons. He is, in fact, the most important artist of the Italian Renaissance to have had a father who was also an artist. It would seem that it's less easy to inherit talent in the visual arts than in music. Most great composers were the sons of men who were at least musicians. In this room in the house, there is displayed a Madonna and Child, which tradition tributes to Raphael at the age of 11. His father, in fact, died when he was 11, but he had uncles who were also painters who then took over his education. This is also supposed to be the room in the house where Raphael was born. If that Madonna is by Raphael, it is his earliest surviving work, but many think it isn't, which would make this self-portrait done at the age of 13 his earliest work. Albrecht Dürer also produced a self-portrait sketch at 13, so they are probably tied for the honor of being the youngest major artists to ever do such things. At the age of 16, Raphael began his official job training as an apprentice to Perugino in Perugia. At the same time Botticelli and Ghirlandaio were painting the walls of the Sistine Chapel, Perugino is there as well, and his most famous painting is still on the wall, Christ presenting the keys to St. Peter. This was a very important episode because the popes claimed that, as St. Peter's successors, they had the same authority that Peter was given, the authority to, in effect, say who could and could not be admitted to heaven and under what circumstances, from which sprang the whole machinery of purgatory and indulgences so abhorred by the Protestants. It's the Vulgate text of this episode from the Gospel of Matthew, which is inscribed around the base of the dome over the altar of St. Peter's itself. This is Raphael's painting of the Marriage of the Virgin, now in the Brera Gallery in Milan. It's doubtful that Raphael had seen that picture by Perugino in Rome before he painted this at the age of 21, but he must have seen preliminary sketches for it or something like that, because the format here is very similar, only with the Virgin now in the position of Jesus in Perugino's picture. This was painted for the Church of San Francesco in Città di Castello near Arezzo, which claimed to own the Virgin's wedding ring, whence the appropriateness of the subject. Here we can see the Virgin with her ladies-in-waiting up closer. Probably the word most often used to describe Raphael's early pictures is lovely, and some would say that this loveliness borders at times on saccharinity, although the Virgin's neck here would fit a small dinosaur. I think it's fair to say he picked up his way of painting women from Perugino. We haven't seen any of Perugino's women, but they look like the sisters of the women in this picture. Here's the beautiful building in the background up closer now. This is Raphael's earliest signed work, and you can see his name and the date 1504, which makes him about 21 at the time. Perugia, where he painted this, was known in the Renaissance as something like the Dodge City of Italy. Dead bodies with knives sticking out of them had to be hauled out of the public squares every morning, but none of that seems to have affected Raphael. This is not a very complex landscape, certainly, but the dawn light gives it a poetic touch, and Raphael will later paint some of the most serenely beautiful landscape backgrounds of the whole Renaissance.
One of the possible sources for Raphael's background building is Bramani's Tempietto Martyrium, part of the complex of San Pietro and Montorio in Rome, which had just been completed. It's always been regarded as a Renaissance masterpiece, almost more like a work of sculpture than a building. It's sometimes thought to have even influenced the look of the Dome of St. Peter's, although the scale is, of course, very different.
This is Raphael's St. George and the Dragon in the Washington National Gallery. This was apparently painted as a gift from Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, the son of Federigo the Hook-Nosed, to Henry VII of England. George wears the Order of the Garter on his leg, of which, in fact, Guidobaldo had been made a member. It's a small picture, only about a foot high, at least until he moved to Rome about 1508. Raphael was a very mainstream 15th century style Renaissance painter in that he put no more action and emotion than he had to into his pictures. Since this is a man fighting a dragon, there has to be some action, but this is nevertheless about the most serene and tranquil dragon fight a man could imagine. The horse just seems to be posing and smiling back at the camera. There's not a leaf stirring, not a cloud in the sky. And one thing I don't think I've mentioned is that there was never any weather in the Renaissance. The sky was almost always fair, or at least not stormy, or so we would judge from the art of the age. It will be the Baroque painters who first really exploit the power of weather to affect the emotional content of a painting. Compare this picture to the version Rubens painted of the same subject, and that comparison will allow you to see at a glance the basic difference between Renaissance tranquility and Baroque energy.
Take that, vile dragon.
This is the Piccolomini Library, now in the Cathedral of Siena. For several years, from about 1504 to 1508, it's hard to know exactly where Raphael was at any given time, though he spent quite a bit of time in Florence, at least off and on during those years. His friend Pinturicchio painted these pictures for the Piccolomini family here in Siena, immortalizing its most famous member, Pope Pius II, about whom we heard earlier as the enemy of Sigismundo Malatesta. Raphael appears in one of the pictures, as we'll see, which some think indicates he might have had something, though certainly very little, to do with the work here. In any case, this library is a very impressive place and should not be missed by anyone who goes to Siena. In this picture, Pius II is recognizing the sanctity of St. Catherine of Siena, and at the lower left are Pinturicchio with the red hat and Raphael in the brown pants and blue cape. Like Michelangelo, Raphael had very little experience with fresco painting before going to work for Julius II. Even if Raphael was here, as in some sense Pinturicchio's assistant when this was being painted, scholars are unanimous in thinking that he contributed nothing significant to it. Here you can see another of the pictures, this time with Pius presiding over the wedding of the Emperor Frederick III and Eleonora of Portugal. You can see Siena in the back, and that's the cathedral in the distance. where the library is. As I said, a good deal of his time was spent in Florence before he left for Rome, and he became something of a Madonna specialist there. This is the so-called Madonna della Grantuca in the Pitti Palace. Of the 20 or so Madonnas he is thought to have painted in Florence and elsewhere, this was long thought to be the finest, but the sort of melancholy sentimentality, the loveliness of it is not so popular with today's connoisseurs as it once was. This is the so-called Madonna della Tenda, the Madonna by the Drape in Munich, which is a little more cheerful. It should be pointed out that these Madonnas were not typically meant to serve as altar pieces. This is an important point, but were hung in homes or private chapels, perhaps for private devotion. This is the Canigiani Holy Family, also in Munich. You may remember that Leonardo was in Florence working on the Virgin Child and St. Anne and Mona Lisa at the time Raphael was painting these pictures. And some see the influence of the Virgin Child and St. Anne in the organization of this picture, as well as in the dawn or dusk sky, by the light of which Leonardo, of course, says it's best to paint. This is the Taddei Madonna in the Vienna Art History Museum now, with a kind of Mona Lisa-like expression on the Virgin's face. And this is the Madonna with the goldfinch, in which the Virgin is almost a duplicate of the one we just saw. This now is not another lovely Virgin Mary. This is a portrait of the not-so-lovely Maddalena Doni. But some see the influence of Mona Lisa here also in the pose of the subject, if not in her looks. Despite the homeliness of the subject, however, as a work of art, I think it's fair to call it beautiful. The coloring of it certainly is, and that's another poetic dawn or dusk sky of the sort Leonardo liked. Here's her husband, Agnolo Doni, who is one of the very few men to have had a work of art made for him by both Michelangelo and Raphael. He's the fellow for whom Michelangelo painted the Holy Family we saw earlier, Michelangelo's only certain panel picture. It's clear from these portraits that although Raphael, like everyone else, always idealized the Madonna, when realism was wanted, he had it in him. One of Raphael's most popular pictures is this one known as La Muta, the only picture by him now in his hometown of Urbino in the Ducal Palace Museum there. The subject reminds people of Mona Lisa also because of the way she's posed, but also because of the aura of mystery around her. And in the case of La Muta, the silent lady, we don't even know who she is or why she was painted, though it's likely she's someone Raphael did paint in Florence. In 1508, then, Raphael went to Rome. Vasari says that Bramante had told Julius II that Raphael was the guy he should have decorate the rooms in the papal palace additions he was building, and Julius agreed to give Raphael a trial. About 1511, Raphael painted Julius's portrait, and some think the original picture doesn't survive, although there are at least copies, probably by Raphael's own hand, which do. This is the version in the London National Gallery, which is most likely the original, say most scholars, but there are also others in the Uffizi and the Pitti Palace. Wilderin says the original was the greatest of all portraits, although he admits he's not sure which is the original or if it even survives, which makes his claim a little unconvincing. This is kind of a puzzling picture also because it doesn't look like Julius is supposed to look. He's the warrior pope, all fire and brimstone, and here he just looks like a tired old man. But maybe in some way this is the real Julius, unless Raphael just caught him on a down day. can see the Papal Palace as it was rebuilt, beginning with Bramani's work on the left behind Bernini's 17th century colonnade. The top floor above Bramani's work was added later by Raphael when he became the Pope's architect. The rest of the palace wasn't finished until later in the 16th century, and the block on the right is the papal residence today. The rooms, the stanza, which Raphael was to decorate, are on the floor which is just below the top section which he built. You can just see a part of the peaked roof of the Sistine Chapel there behind the palace at the far left, where Michelangelo was at work while Raphael was painting in the palace. This is the Disputa, or discussion about the nature of the Holy Sacrament, which was the first painting Raphael did here in the room called the Stanza della Segnatura, the Pope's office. Julius was so pleased by this fresco that he immediately turned the whole project over to Raphael and ordered the work that had already been done by other artists, including Raphael's friend and teacher Perugino, whitewashed. I mentioned how amazing it was that Michelangelo painted the greatest fresco ever on his first try, but this is also Raphael's first fresco, and he was just 26, 8 years younger than Michelangelo. Raphael was commissioned now to paint all 4 walls in each of 4 rooms, a total of 16 giant pictures. The figures here are life-size, but he was to complete only about half the project. Here you can see part of the right-hand section up closer. These are men, not women, but it is usually said that Bramani let Raphael into the Sistine Chapel to see what Michelangelo was doing, and that this had a profound effect on the way he painted. Lovely is not a word that comes to mind here. Raphael is no longer a painter of the pretty, but of the impressive, whether or not Michelangelo should have the credit for influencing him. St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure are identified here by the names on their halos, and we are perhaps supposed to see Julius between them, and that is his favorite uncle Sixtus IV at the right. Some say Gregory the Great rather than Julius is the man between the two saints, but the fellow has no halo, and no one has ever tried to argue that Julius was a saint. That's certainly Dante's unmistakable profile, and some think we see Savonarola over the shoulder of the fellow in blue, which seems doubtful to me, but he was, of course, a great enemy of the Borgias, whom Julius also hated. Up in heaven there are more heroes of the church. Including, from left to right, St. Peter, maybe Adam, but he seems out of place here. John the Evangelist, David, and then perhaps St. Stephen and Jeremiah. On the opposite wall, Raphael painted the so-called School of Athens, and in this photograph you can get a better idea of the scale of the work. So on one wall we have the heroes of Christianity, and directly opposite and given equal attention, we have the heroes of the classical world with hardly a Christian in sight, and at least one Muslim in the group. I have, of course, pointed out before how the church from the early Middle Ages on attempted to make the great pre-Christian thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, in some sense sort of honorary Christians at least, and often accorded them something like the status of the Old Testament heroes. And here you have a very impressive example of just that kind of thing. Here you can see the School of Athens more clearly now. I think in a way what we see here is something like a painted version of Dante's Limbo. Dante was also sympathetic to the classical world, and its heroes aren't put in hell, but rather in limbo, where the only punishment is isolation from paradise. But their part of limbo is a nice place, and he talks about it having 7 gates, which this space seems to have if we don't count the opening through which we're looking into it. And those are statues of the classical gods Apollo, whom Dante asks for inspiration in the attempt to describe paradise, and Minerva to the left and right above the philosophers. We're going to see this in a little more detail now, and also see some of the pictures on the walls in the next room, the Stanze di Eliodoro, and hear another piece of music by Josquin des Prez. This will be the Gloria from the Missa la Marmee. In this detail, the second fellow from the right there who is looking at us is Raphael himself. Zoroaster and Ptolemy are said to be the fellows with the globes, and Euclid is the fellow with the compass teaching geometry. Some think Euclid is a portrait of Bramante. For some reason, Kenneth Clark thinks the figure in brown pointing down is Leonardo. On the other side, the Arabic-looking fellow at the left is said to be Averroes, the Muslim philosopher famous for his commentary on Aristotle. He's looking over the shoulder of Boethius, famous for his Consolation of Philosophy and for his textbooks on logic, math, and music. At the right, the last figure painted is Michelangelo, playing the role of Heraclitus and wearing those boots he almost never took off and a blue sculptor's smock. They did not get along that well, however. Of Raphael, Michelangelo said, "What he had of art he had from me." On one occasion they are supposed to have unexpectedly encountered one another, Raphael accompanied as usual by a whole entourage. And Michelangelo said, "Oh, it's you, Raphael. I thought you were a prince with all these courtiers." To which Raphael responded, "And I thought you were the hangman because you're always alone." In the center of the composition are figures representing Plato and Aristotle, and the upward pointing finger of Plato, indicating presumably his more spiritual interests, does suggest this might be Leonardo. Aristotle, in contrast, puts his hand out over the earth, indicating his more material interests. This is the picture which gives the stanza de Eliodoro its name. In the apocryphal book of 2nd Maccabees, this fellow Eliodoro tries to rob the temple and is driven off by a pair of angels, as you see at the lower right. At the left, Julius himself is being carried in. The fellow on the far side carrying the litter is Raphael again, while the bearded fellow opposite him is Marcantonio Raimondi, an artist who was a friend of Raphael's. On another wall in this room is the Mass at Bolsena, where we see Julius praying before going off to fight the French. And here you see his Swiss mercenaries below. It was, in fact, Julius who founded the Swiss Guard. On this wall in the stanza di Eliodoro is the confrontation between Attila and Leo the Great back in the 5th century, when the Pope did something to change Attila's mind about attacking Italy. Here Peter and Paul are shown having appeared waving swords at the barbarians, which probably would have done the trick. And this time it's Leo X playing the role of the Pope after Julius's death. He had already been painted in there as a cardinal, so he appears twice in the picture. Okay, that's where we'll wind up today. Next week we'll finish Raphael's career and then spend the rest of the day in Venice.